Picture this. A tiny hut on the edge of a frozen valley. The wind scratches at the walls like a beggar turned away too many times. Inside, a woman kneels beside her child, pressing a glowing stone to its chest so the little body doesn't turn blue before dawn. Now, picture another world. A palace far to the south, where the air hums with heat. The queen walks barefoot across marble floors that still remember the desert sun. Her bracelets chime softly, metal singing to metal, as she murmurs to a mirror carved from obsidian. Two worlds, one ruled by frost, the other by fire. And yet their survival, their gods, their futures, depend on the same secret. Tonight, I will take you there. From the ashes of the northern huts to the gold-stained dust of forgotten kingdoms. This is the secret world of queens and servants. Good evening, traveler. Before we begin, take a breath with me. Let the day's noise drift to the far edges of the room. Maybe you're listening from a small apartment with city lights blinking through the blinds. Maybe from a farmhouse kitchen where the night hums with crickets. Wherever you are, slow the air in your lungs. Feel the temperature of your space, warm or cool, familiar. History, too, begins with temperature. When I first started studying the stories of Valmere and Saethem, I didn't expect them to feel alive. I thought I would find fragments, ruins, inscriptions, brittle words pressed into clay. But what I found was warmth. Not metaphorical warmth, but something physical. The way old hearthstones still hold a trace of heat long after the flame has gone. That's what I want you to imagine now. A small hut, its walls stitched with smoke. A hearth glowing faintly, not with fire but with memory. The air smells of earth and damp wool. Someone, a woman, perhaps, is grinding herbs in a stone bowl, her breath rising in tiny white clouds. This is where our story begins. Not in a palace, not in a temple, but in a place where survival meant learning the language of warmth. There's a rhythm to nights like this. The crackle of ash, the sigh of wind under the door, the faint hiss when someone adds a wet log to the fire. Every sound matters because silence is dangerous. Silence means the fire might be dying. In the north, they believed that to keep warm was to stay visible to the gods, to freeze was to be forgotten. When I first read those lines in a traveler's diary from centuries ago, I remember stopping mid-sentence. The author wrote, "We sleep in turns beside the embers, not from fear of beasts, but from fear of forgetting the warmth." I underlined it twice. It struck me that in every age, humans build rituals around the things they're most afraid to lose. For Valmere, it was heat. For us, maybe it's connection. So, dim the lights around you. Let the screens glow by your hearth for a while. You don't need to imagine much, only the feeling of quiet closeness that comes when the world outside has gone cold. If you listen closely, you might almost hear the faint pop of resin burning, the slow exhale of the wind. Sometimes, when I record these stories late at night, I picture all of you out there. Hundreds of small rooms scattered across the map, each with someone listening. The thought is oddly comforting. Across centuries and distances, warmth still connects us. A simple thing. Breath leaving one body, reaching another through sound. The villagers of Valmere would have understood that perfectly. They had a word, talir, meaning shared heat. It wasn't romantic or spiritual, it was practical. To talir meant to live. Travelers who survived blizzards together were said to be talir bound. I find that beautiful. Not lovers, not comrades. Just people who once kept each other alive through proximity. Maybe that's what we're doing here tonight. Gathering around a digital hearth, keeping the ancient instinct alive in a new form. The technology is different, but the need is the same. Every civilization, no matter how advanced, begins by learning how to keep something burning. Outside the hut, the valley is frozen silver. You can almost feel the weight of the stars pressing down on the snow. Inside, shadows move slowly across the walls. Someone adjusts a child's blanket. Another person stirs the pot, tasting for salt. The smell of root stew thickens the air. Every gesture carries meaning because everything is limited: warmth, food, time. When I think about the world of Valmere, I don't imagine heroes or kings. I imagine these small acts of endurance. The tenderness of a mother testing her child's breath against her wrist. The discipline of a man splitting wood he knows won't be enough. The quiet companionship of neighbors who share a glowing stone instead of bread. There's humility in that kind of life. And maybe, a wisdom we've forgotten, that survival is rarely solitary. The villagers didn't just trade goods, they traded warmth, stories, songs. They believed that memory itself had temperature, that remembering someone kept them warm in the afterlife. When the chroniclers of Saethem, far to the south, later wrote about the northern tribes, they called them the people of the fire. It wasn't an insult, it was an observation. Saethem had its own sun, its own abundance, but even they understood the holiness of the hearth. In their temples, they painted murals of northern huts glowing like stars beneath the snow. To them, the north was not a wasteland but a mirror, a reminder that light means nothing without darkness to measure it against. So tonight, before the story widens into empires and legends, I want you to sit with that image. A single flame in a single room, defying an infinite cold. Because that's where everything begins, with defiance. The decision to exist despite the conditions. I often wonder what the first storyteller of Valmere sounded like. Maybe her voice trembled from the chill. Maybe she spoke to children huddled under firs, inventing gods out of smoke patterns. Or maybe she spoke to no one at all, whispering to the fire just to hear another living sound. Whoever she was, she started something that reached all the way here, to me, to you. That's the strange thing about history. We study empires, but what survives are the moments of care. A bowl of stew, a hand shielding a flame, a story told to keep the dark at bay. If you wish, you can whisper in the comments where you're listening from. It's not a command, only an invitation. When I read those messages later, Tokyo, 3 a.m., or Lisbon, rain outside, I imagine all those scattered hearts lighting up again. Proof that warmth can travel farther than we think. And so, our story opens not with conquest or prophecy, but with quiet endurance. A valley of frost, a mother with a glowing stone. A world that has not yet learned the difference between faith and physics, only that both keep the fire alive. Stay close now. The wind outside is rising, and the embers are beginning to breathe. I remember Valmere the way a hand remembers the weight of a familiar tool. Not through pictures, but through use. Morning smoke stitched itself through thatched roofs, thin and blue. Pots clattered like bells with no church to claim them. The snow kept its own soft grammar along fence posts and boot prints, and we read it without thinking. Fox, hare, neighbor, stray cow. Each mark a sentence about survival. We lived by small, repeating acts. Warming a bowl, mending a seam, counting the logs remaining and deciding which worry to feed first. Our houses were mud and timber, patched where winters had chewed too hard. We pressed sprigs of juniper into the walls because the elders said it taught the clay to breathe. On some door frames, someone had carved little spirals, hope in a language that wasn't letters yet. When sunlight found those grooves in late autumn, the room glowed with a quiet ambition. We would last at least one more season. Life followed a rhythm that felt older than the valley. Spring thaw, calf cries, mud to the knees. Summer work, stacking hay, salting fish, carrying water in shoulders that learned the shape of burden early. Autumn harvest, smokehouses speaking in steady sighs. And then the long winter, when you watched the fire like a heartbeat and learned how patience was a kind of bread. We were poor, yes, but our poverty had rules. Lean months arrived on schedule, like strict uncles who always knocked twice. Children grew up under the spell of chores and stories. They played around steaming cauldrons, tracing faces in the condensation on iron lids. Mothers patched wool with hands stiff from washwater. Fathers stacked frozen logs, listening for the dry rain that meant a piece would burn hot and clean. On feast days, songs braided prayer with laughter. On hard days, the same songs slowed, as if words themselves could hold back cold. Even our curses belonged to the weather. We swore by winds and thaw. We asked forgiveness from rivers when we took their fish. We had gods, though they did not live in palaces. Elandra of the hearth, a name spoken low, as if volume might waste heat. Offerings were humble. A pinch of salt, a sliver of fat, a story told aloud so the god would not feel lonely. We did not imagine her as a queen. We imagined her as a breath that never fogs, a coal that never fully goes to sleep. When new babies came, an auntie would carry them past each neighbor's door so their first warmth would be shared, not hoarded. We believed, I still believe, that generosity lengthens winter days. Trade reached us like a rumor with boots. Peddlers brought brass needles, lamp oil, salt cakes wrapped in cloth stamped with the southern sun. In return, we gave pelts, dried mushrooms, and the rare amber our boys found along the riverbanks when the ice retreated. From these travelers we learned of Saethem, a place where heat fell from the sky like blessings and people covered their heads not from snow, but from light. We laughed and called it a fable. Still, when we salted meat, I pictured a city tasting everything before it rotted. Knowledge moved in circles, not lines. My grandmother kept a calendar of bones, tiny notches carved into a sheep's rib to count the moons. She said the frost had rules, the first hard bite after leaf fall, the glassy stillness in midwinter, the false thaws that tricked sap into rising too soon. Cold is honest, she told me once, laying a palm near the ash bed. It announces its terms. Your job is to answer with terms of your own. That was our science. Answer the valley without anger, without pride. We kept maps only in our heads. Where the drifted paths stayed firm, where the creek formed thin ice that looked trustworthy until it wasn't, where the wind died and smoke fell. You learned to breathe lower then, so you didn't drink the air. The northern lights were our only court finery, and even they felt practical, reminding hunters that north was indeed north, even when the stars hid. It would be tempting to call us content, but contentment isn't the right word. We were exact. We matched our lives to the valley's measurements, stitch for stitch. When someone died, the whole village wore dark wool not for grief alone but to save dye for spraying. When someone married, the feast stretched as far as the salted meat would allow and no further. We knew the taste of enough. If there was luxury, it was time beside the hearth after the chores were done. In that hour, elders took out the memory box, a wooden chest with a broken hinge, and held up tokens. A brass thimble, a flaked arrowhead, a coin from Saethem that felt warm even in winter. Proof, they said, smiling at our wide eyes, that other worlds exist, but they eat and sleep too. We learned humility that way, the fantasy of elsewhere placed gently beside the weight of here. And so the people of Valmere carved hope into mud walls and made a covenant with their cold. You arrive on time, and so will we. We truly believed we understood the exchange. Warmth for work, bread for patience, safety for vigilance. We made our lives a ledger and kept it balanced as best we could. Until the night the rules changed. That winter came too soon. Even now, when I close my eyes, I can still hear the sound of the river freezing, not gradually, not in its usual slow crawl toward silence, but all at once, like a blade pressed to glass. We were still pulling turnips from half-frozen soil when the first snow fell. The air turned metallic, sharp enough to sting your lungs. And with it came a stillness so complete, it felt as if the valley itself had stopped breathing. The elders said the frost had lost its manners. We tried to laugh, the way people do when unease is still young. But laughter fogged and vanished before it reached the ceiling. The smoke in our chimneys thickened to a color I had never seen before, not gray, not black, but the shade of exhaustion itself. And then, as if the sky grew tired of watching us, it began to snow without pause. Days blurred into a pale sameness. The rhythm we'd built, the patient exchange between work and warmth, fell apart. The grain spoiled in the bins. The fish traps froze to the riverbed. Wood cracked faster than we could chop it. Even the animals stopped calling to one another. the forest went mute. We kept to our huts, guarding every spark like it was a newborn child. When smoke stopped rising from a neighbor's chimney, no one went to check. We couldn't spare the heat. We told ourselves they had moved closer to the mountain for shelter. We told ourselves many things. I remember the first night our own fire died. The embers had been failing for hours, and every breath I took felt like inhaling shards of moonlight. My mother's hands were raw from striking flint. My little brother whimpered without sound, his lips too stiff to open. Somewhere between panic and prayer, she whispered the name of Elandra, the goddess of warmth, as if speaking might thaw the air. And then, he arrived. No one heard him approach. There was no knock, no crunch of snow. Just a flicker of movement at the threshold, a shadow heavier than the dark around it. He was cloaked, hood drawn low, but his eyes, they burned like coals buried in ash. He carried a small pouch in one hand, and when he opened it, the air filled with a faint blue shimmer, as though the night itself had turned liquid. Without a word, he knelt by the dead hearth. From the pouch he took a handful of dust, glowing faintly, and cast it into the ashes. The room bloomed with heat, fierce, instant, alive. The kind of warmth that doesn't just touch skin but floods through bone. The frost on the walls melted into rivulets that hissed as they ran toward the floorboards. My mother cried out, not in fear, but in relief so pure it sounded like grief. When I turned to thank him, he was gone. Only the smell of smoke and something like iron remained. Outside, the snow reflected the light of our rekindled fire, orange against endless white. We searched the drifts for his footprints, but they ended halfway across the yard, fading into steam. The neighbors came running, drawn by the impossible sight of flame. For the first time in weeks, laughter, real, human laughter, cracked the night. By dawn, every hearth in the village burned again. We shared what was left of that strange dust, passing pinches of it from one household to another. The fires that sprang from it burned cleaner, hotter, longer. The smoke no longer stung the eyes. We tried to understand, but the words failed us. Some said he was a spirit sent by Elandra herself. Others whispered about an exile from the southern lands, a keeper of forbidden alchemy. Whatever he was, he saved us. In the days that followed, the cold retreated, not fully, but enough for the rivers to whisper again beneath their armor of ice. The cattle survived. Children sang again. The valley exhaled. But beneath our gratitude, a seed of unease took root. We had seen the rules of our world bend, and none of us knew what debt would come due for that mercy. That night, as the fire hummed and shadows danced like grateful ghosts, my mother pressed a warm stone into my palm. One she had taken from the hearth after the stranger left. "Keep it," she said softly. "It remembers." I slept with it against my chest, dreaming of blue light and footsteps that melted as they walked. By morning, he was legend. We gave him names. The Ember Bearer, the Frost's enemy, the one who walked through winter. Children drew his shape in soot on the walls, a figure with 2 eyes of fire and hands full of dust. We told ourselves he would return if the cold ever dared to overstay its welcome again. But the next winter came, and he did not. Still, the embers we had saved refused to die completely. Even when the wind howled, even when the nights stretched endless, there was always a glow somewhere, faint, defiant, alive. We began to believe the fire itself had changed, that it carried a memory stronger than any prayer. And so Valmere endured, by miracle, by rumor, by the fragile heat of a stranger's gift. None of us yet understood that the night he appeared was not a rescue, but the beginning of a new covenant between warmth and will. The old world had cracked. We just hadn't heard the sound yet. I sometimes think our survival that winter wasn't a miracle at all, but an accident that we learned how to repeat. The stranger never returned, but what he left behind changed us more deeply than any god. It wasn't just the fire that burned differently, it was us. Something in the valley had shifted, and though we pretended to believe in divine intervention, deep down, we knew we were dealing with a new kind of law. Not faith, not magic, something that belonged to the earth itself. In the months that followed, people began to experiment. They took the remaining blue dust and mixed it with ash, soil, salt, even blood. Some combinations failed, snuffing out the flame. Others produced warmth that lingered for days. My mother, ever patient, recorded each attempt in a small leather book. Not words exactly, but marks and symbols that only she could read. When she found a mixture that worked, she hummed under her breath, a sound I came to associate with discovery. "Remember this," she would whisper to me. "Fire likes to be courted, not commanded." Soon, every family had its own method, a private recipe for keeping the embers alive. But no one hoarded knowledge for long. We were too aware of the cost of isolation. So we began to trade heat the way others traded grain or salt. A warm stone passed from one household to another became both blessing and debt. We called them hearthstones, though they were never truly stones, more like hardened ash, dense and faintly luminous when touched by moonlight. Children carried them in pockets on cold walks to the stream, and elders tucked them beside their beds to ease the ache in their bones. The act of exchanging them grew ritualistic. Each evening, as twilight sank into the valley, people gathered in small circles. One family would bring their ember, another would offer theirs, and the two would be pressed together until both glowed brighter. Then, each household took one back home. We didn't yet have a name for what we were doing, but it was the beginning of something larger, a quiet network of survival that pulsed beneath the frost like a second heartbeat. It was my grandmother who first called it the Ash Covenant. She said warmth was a living spirit that could not be owned, only borrowed. To hoard it was to offend Elandra, who had given the first flame to the stranger. So we built a system, part faith, part necessity, to keep the covenant alive. Every season, one family was chosen as the Ash Keepers. Their duty was to collect the remnants of burned fires, sift through the ash, and salvage any coal that still whispered heat. Those coals would be buried in a communal pit at the edge of the village, layered with straw and salt to keep them dry. In spring, when the snow began to melt, the keepers unearthed the pit, and the first new fires were lit from those ancient embers. It wasn't science yet, but it was close. I was 10 the first time I helped with the burial. The pit smelled of old smoke and rain. We worked by lamplight, careful not to breathe too hard lest the smallest spark escape. When the final shovel of ash fell, the eldest keeper, a woman named Irena, traced a circle over the mound and said, "Heat is the memory of motion. Do not let it forget." I didn't understand the words, but they lodged in me like a seed. Years later, when scholars from the South came to study our rituals, they would translate that phrase as an early understanding of energy conservation. But for us, it was simply reverence. The covenant changed our relationships, too. Disputes between neighbors often ended not with punishment but with a withdrawal of warmth. If you broke trust, no one would share embers with you until you made amends. We learned quickly that isolation was colder than any storm. And so, generosity became survival. By the third winter, the practice had matured into something almost bureaucratic. The keepers kept records, small tablets of pressed clay, each marked with the emblem of a household and the number of stones contributed or received. It looked like accounting, but it was closer to prayer. "The fire remembers who feeds it," my mother said once, pressing her thumb into a wet tablet. So should we. The most sacred moment of the year was the night of rekindling. On that night, every hearth in Valmere was extinguished. For a single hour, the entire valley went dark, the only time we willingly faced total cold. Then, the ash keepers carried a single glowing coal from the communal pit, shielded by a bowl carved from riverstone. One by one, families relit their fires from that single source, passing the flame along a chain of torches until the whole valley shimmered again. From the cliffs, it must have looked like a necklace of living stars. I still remember standing in the doorway, watching our small light join the others, feeling that brief, impossible unity. Every breath synchronized, every hand steady on the same warmth. We didn't realize it then, but we were building the foundation of our culture, a system that turned heat into currency, faith, and science all at once. The ashkeepers' knowledge grew more precise. They learned which woods burned longest, how different clays trapped heat, how the color of smoke could predict weather. They began to shape their findings into what they called the breath laws, instructions on how to tend fires, how to breathe near them so as not to steal their vigor. In through the nose, out through the heart, they said, a phrase both absurd and profound. Children learned it before they could write their names. Over time, even our language changed. Words for temperature multiplied. There was Varun for the warmth that lives inside a body, Talir for heat shared between people, and Mirath for the dangerous blaze that devours rather than sustains. To lose one's temper was literally to spill Mirath. Fire became our grammar, the syntax of existence. Centuries later, scholars would describe our rituals as proto-thermodynamics. They would map our stories onto physics and claim we had stumbled upon the conservation of energy through superstition. I don't disagree, but I also think those scholars missed something essential, that superstition was our way of feeling truth before naming it. The covenant spread quietly beyond the valley. Travelers carried tales of self-sustaining fires and stones that never cooled. Merchants from the south traded for them, curious about their endurance. Some tried to replicate the process, grinding the stones to powder and selling them as charms. But without the ritual, the breath, the rhythm of sharing, the heat faded. They had stolen the form but not the faith. By then, I was grown, apprenticed to the keepers myself. I learned how to read the pulse of ash, how to tell if a fire had been tended with care or neglect. You could see it in the residue. Good ash lay soft and gray, bad ash clumped black, angry with soot. My hands bore permanent smudges, lines of gray etched into the creases like a second set of fingerprints. You're marked now, Irena told me once, smiling. The fire won't forget you. Looking back, I understand that the covenant did more than keep us alive. It created a society where warmth meant trust, and trust meant survival. The structure of our lives mirrored the structure of the flame, layered, interdependent, always consuming yet renewing. No one commanded the fire, we negotiated with it, learned its moods, courted its favor with breath and patience. It was both resource and witness. And yet, even within this harmony, there were doubts. Some questioned whether the blue dust had been a gift or a test. Why had the stranger chosen us? Why had he vanished? The priests of Elandra claimed he was her messenger, proof that the goddess rewarded loyalty. The scholars whispered other theories, that he had come from Saethem, bringing with him the secret of captured sunlight. Whatever the truth, we built an entire civilization around that mystery. Sometimes, late at night, when the coals dimmed and everyone slept, I would take one of the old stones from the hearth and hold it in my palm. Even after years, it still pulsed faintly, as though remembering its origin. It felt alive, not in a mystical sense, but in the way of something that has purpose. I realized then that what we called faith was simply the habit of observation stretched over generations. We had turned survival into ceremony, and ceremony into law. That was our genius, and, though we didn't know it yet, our blindness. Because every system that protects also confines. Every covenant creates an inside and an outside. And one day, someone will always ask what happens if you step beyond the circle of light. For now, though, we basked in our own success. The winters grew less cruel, the fires steadier. The ash-keepers became counselors to chieftains, guardians of both flame and wisdom. We believed we had mastered the balance between warmth and want. But warmth is never free. It remembers its price, and soon, it would come to collect. My earliest memory of Mira isn't of her face but of her hands, darkened with soot, veins glowing faintly from the heat she worked with every day. She moved like someone negotiating with the air itself, coaxing it into balance. When she lifted a coal from the fire, it didn't hiss or smoke. It seemed to recognize her, as if relieved to have been found by its keeper. People said she had been born on the longest night of the year, when the sky split briefly with blue light, a sign, they believed, that Elandra had chosen her. Mira never confirmed it, but she didn't deny it either. I was a child then, one of many apprentices who crowded her small hut at the edge of the valley. We came with empty notebooks and burned fingers, hoping to learn how she could keep a flame alive for weeks without tending. She always began the same way. "You don't keep fire alive," she would say, smiling. "You keep yourself alive beside it." Mira had inherited her mother's role as an ashkeeper, but she treated it more like a calling than a duty. Her hut smelled of resin, herbs, and metal, a mixture that seemed to hang in the air long after you left. On the walls hung tools that glowed faintly in the dark, tongs carved from river bone, jars of preserved embers, and scrolls filled with drawings of lungs, hearts, and hearths, as if they were all parts of the same anatomy. Every morning, before the rest of the village stirred, she would walk to the river with a pot of ash and pour a handful into the current. "Payment," she murmured, "for what we borrow." I didn't understand what she meant until years later. The fire wasn't hers to command, it was a dialogue. She gave, it answered. Her reputation spread quickly. People came from neighboring valleys to watch her rituals. They brought sick children, broken tools, cold stones. Mira treated them all with the same calm precision. She warmed stones in her oven until they glowed like captured dawn, then pressed them to fevered skin or brittle metal. More often than not, what she touched seemed to mend. Some called her healer, others whispered witch, but to us, she was simply Mira, the woman who made winter hesitate. Then came the night that burned her legend into permanence. It was the solstice, the long silence, when even the wind seemed to pause out of respect for the dark. I remember the smell of smoke turning sour, the sound of glass cracking from the sudden heat. Mira's hut was on fire. We saw it from the ridge, a pillar of flame in a valley of snow. By the time we reached her, the roof had collapsed. Sparks leapt into the sky like frightened spirits. She was inside, they said, trying to save her daughter. When we found the child, Liana, she was wrapped in Mira's cloak, cradled beneath a half-fallen beam. Her cheeks were black with soot, but she was breathing. In her small fist, she clutched a glowing stone so hot it should have scorched her skin, yet it didn't. I remember kneeling beside her, realizing the impossible. The stone's light pulsed in rhythm with her heartbeat. Mira was gone. Some said she had stepped into the flames willingly, offering herself to Elandra as payment for her gifts. Others claimed the goddess had taken her back. But when we sifted through the ashes, we found no body, only footprints leading away from the ruin, fading into the snow toward the mountains. Liana became the village's secret. We raised her carefully, as one raises a candle in wind. She grew quiet, watchful, and strangely calm. When she played with the other children, she always avoided the coldest spots in the yard, as if she could sense where warmth ended. On her 10th birthday, she placed her hand over the hearth and said, "It breathes slower now." She was right. The fire had begun to fail that year, as if missing her mother. She apprenticed under the new keepers, learning the rituals by instinct more than study. She could glance at an ember and tell how long it would last. She claimed she heard the hum, a low vibration in the coals that told her when to feed them. The elders called it inheritance. The younger ones called it proof that the goddess had not abandoned us. Then the traders came, southerners from Saethem, with their gold-threaded cloaks and eyes that seemed always to measure value. They brought spices, silk, and stories of a land where heat fell freely from the sky. They saw Liana's talent and saw, too, what it could mean. In the south, one said, you could warm a palace with a single breath. That was how she left us. We told ourselves it was choice, but it was not. Saethem's emissaries offered silver, rare herbs, and the promise of teaching. The council agreed. Our fire was dying, our resources thinning. They believed sending Liana to learn from the south might bring back a cure. I stood by the road when she departed, carrying a pouch of northern stones tied at her belt. She didn't look back. Years later, when I heard rumors of the queen's servant of Saethem, a young woman with ash-streaked hair who could light fires with her hands, I knew it was her. The traders who returned spoke of her grace and her silence, of how she spent hours in the royal library, reading scrolls about the ancient queens of Maris who once ruled through balance rather than power. They said she had introduced strange rituals to the palace, ceremonies of breath and heat, where servants and nobles stood together around a shared flame. At first, people mocked it. Then they began to feel its effect. Rooms stayed warm longer. Tempers cooled faster. Even the crops, watered with ash from her hearth, grew taller. She had taken the covenant south and given it new language. But every gift carries its shadow. Some of Saethem's priests accused her of sorcery. They whispered that her fires fed on the souls of the dead, that she mixed sacred oils with northern dust to bind spirits into obedience. The queen, intrigued rather than frightened, made Liana her advisor. The court called her the Whisper of the Hearth. From the letters smuggled back by travelers, I pieced together a picture of her life, part reverence, part peril. She wrote once, though the letter never reached me directly. A friend of a friend carried it home, edges burned by candlelight. It said, "The South believes it owns the sun. But even here, people freeze, not their bodies, but their hearts. I warm what I can. The rest I bury." After that, the letters stopped. We heard rumors, a royal scandal, a forbidden love, the accusation of blasphemy. The details changed with each retelling. Some claimed the king himself had fallen in love with her, naming her queen in secret. Others said the priests framed her for conjuring ghosts beneath the palace. But one phrase echoed through every version: she vanished into smoke. When I grew old, I visited Saethem once, disguised among merchants. The palace was dazzling. Marble courtyards that glowed even at night, fountains steaming with perfumed water. But what caught my eye was a mural in the northern wing. A woman kneeling before a flame, her hands open, her eyes gray as stormlight. Beneath her image, in letters both northern and southern, was written, "Fire does not ask who it warms." The guide said it was a proverb from an extinct tribe. I didn't correct him. I sometimes wonder what became of Liana after that. Perhaps she escaped, walking into the desert the way her mother had walked into the fire. Perhaps she became one with it, a legend carried in the breath of two civilizations that never understood how closely they were bound. What I know is this: the stones she left behind still hum. The rhythm of their pulse is slower now, but it endures. When I hold one near my chest, I can almost feel the faint echo of her heartbeat, the same that once pulsed through the ashes of Mira's burned home. Two women, two worlds, one bound by frost, the other by fire, both serving the same truth. That warmth, whether of hearth or heart, must be shared to survive. And sometimes, to keep it alive, someone must burn. When I arrived in Saethem, the air itself startled me. It moved differently, thick, warm, filled with dust that shimmered like crushed gold in the sunlight. I'd spent my life breathing air that cut like glass, air that demanded you earn every lungful. Here, it came to you freely, a soft tide of heat that pressed against the skin until even stillness felt like movement. The people called it mercy. To me, it felt like forgetting. I came not as an emissary of Valmere, nor as an exile. I came as a shadow following the rumor of a name. Liana, the child I'd once seen wrapped in soot and fire. The one who had walked south carrying our secret in her bones. By the time I reached the gates of Saethem's capital, she had already become myth. The pale woman with gray eyes who could make the palace breathe. They said she spoke little, that her silences rearranged rooms. Saethem was overwhelming. Its towers were pale stone veined with bronze, their rooftops covered in glass that caught the sun and shattered it into color. The markets never slept. Music from 100 instruments tangled with the cries of traders selling spices, silks, oils. And always the scent of heat, a perfume made from sun-baked clay and burning resin. Here, warmth was not scarce, it was currency, ornament, power. The people carried it on their skin, in their jewelry, in the stories they told about their gods. To them, heat was proof of favor, and the absence of it a kind of curse. I remember thinking, What use would they have for the covenant? These were people who never knew cold. They worshipped the sun itself. But that was before I saw the palace. Inside its marble walls, the air was wrong. Stale. Too still. The queen's attendants moved quietly, their faces pale despite the endless heat. They whispered that the fires in the royal hearths had begun to die too quickly, that the marble floors stayed cool even under full sun. The architects blamed poor ventilation, the priests blamed sin, and the queen, young, widowed, weary, blamed herself. That was when Liana appeared at court. She arrived not as a guest, but as a servant, an attendant to one of the queen's advisors. Her northern accent marked her immediately, but instead of mocking her, the courtiers found her voice soothing. They said her presence calmed tempers. One day, when the queen's council descended into shouting over some trivial dispute, Liana simply placed her palm against a nearby brazier. The flame rose, steady and blue, and the room fell silent. "Listen," she said softly. "It's asking for breath." That single moment changed everything. The queen summoned her privately the next morning. What they spoke of remains legend, but by evening, the order went out. The palace hearths were to be rebuilt under Liana's direction. Servants dismantled ancient braziers and replaced them with smaller, rounder vessels lined with clay from the northern hills. The first night they were lit, the heat filled the palace evenly for the first time in years. The courtiers called it sorcery, the queen called it balance. From then on, Liana was no longer a servant. She was advisor of breath. Her methods were strange but undeniable. She taught the palace staff how to feed the air, slow breathing rituals at dawn and dusk, matching inhalation to the flicker of flame. She forbade the burning of rare oils and perfumes, claiming they confused the fire. Instead, she encouraged plain wood and steady rhythm. Within months, the sickness that had plagued the lower halls vanished. Sleep returned to those who had suffered from restless nights. Even the queen's gardens began to bloom out of season. Word spread quickly beyond the palace. Scholars came to observe her work, scribbling notes they barely understood. The city's priests grew uneasy. Power, they knew, is measured by who controls the elements, and Liana was teaching that control to servants and masons. She allowed no hierarchy around the flame. Everyone breathed the same air, stood at the same distance, felt the same warmth. Fire, she told them, does not know titles. It was radical, dangerous, beautiful. I watched her from the edges of gatherings, a quiet figure in simple robes, moving through Saethem's opulent halls like a living contradiction. The nobles, wrapped in gold and silk, found themselves bowing to a woman who wore ash as jewelry. She seemed untouched by vanity, yet her presence commanded reverence. When she spoke, it was with the calm certainty of someone who had long stopped asking permission to exist. Soon, her influence reached beyond architecture and ritual. Merchants began to adapt her practices, using small heated stones to preserve goods during the cooler desert nights. Sailors in the southern ports lined their lanterns with clay mixed with ash, claiming it made the light steadier at sea. Even the scholars of the academy, once skeptical, began incorporating her breath laws into treatises on airflow, energy, and spirit. But with influence came envy. The priests of the solar temple denounced her as heretic. "The sun gives life," they cried, "not this northern witch who steals its light." Liana responded only with silence. When asked to defend herself, she said, "If the sun fears me, it is smaller than I thought." It was the kind of statement that turns faith into politics. The queen protected her at first. She admired Liana's wisdom and depended on her counsel. Under her influence, Saethem entered a period of quiet reform, less spectacle, more reflection. The queen replaced grand festivals with evenings of shared fire, where nobles and servants stood side by side. It was said that during those nights, the entire palace glowed with a warmth that could be felt from the city gates. I was there for one of them. I remember the hush that fell when Liana stepped forward, her gray eyes reflecting the firelight like storm clouds holding the sun. "Warmth is a circle," she said. If it breaks, someone will freeze. She took the queen's hand and placed it beside her own over the flame. For a moment, they were indistinguishable, two silhouettes against light, equal before the element they served. That image spread faster than any decree. The people began to whisper of servant queens, women who ruled not by bloodline but by breath, guiding nations through empathy rather than command. Old songs from the desert resurfaced, tales of the lost city of Maris where queens once shared power with their handmaidens. To the poor, these stories felt like prophecy returned. To the priests, they smelled like rebellion. Within a year, the breath of Saethem had become both movement and menace. Apprentices sought her teachings, artisans carved her symbols into tools and doors. Small communities began practicing her rituals in secret, lighting communal fires and reciting her laws. Heat is shared. Breath is rhythm. Power is balance. What had begun as survival in a frozen valley was now a philosophy spreading through a sunlit empire. And yet, I saw the fatigue in her eyes. Each new follower brought both gratitude and danger. For every hearth that burned brighter, there was a counselor whispering about treason. The priests demanded she renounce her teachings or face trial for blasphemy. The queen hesitated, torn between loyalty and the pressure of her court. The night before the summons was delivered, I found Liana alone in the library. Scrolls surrounded her like sleeping animals. She was reading an ancient text written in two tongues, one northern, one desert. I recognized the curve of our language. She smiled faintly when she saw me. "You kept it alive," I said. She shook her head. "No, it kept me, but now it wants more room to breathe." I asked if she was afraid. "Of what?" She replied. "Fire teaches us that everything ends by becoming light or ash. Either way, it leaves warmth behind." Those were the last words I ever heard from her. The next morning, her chambers were empty. Some said she fled into the desert with a handful of followers. Others insisted she dissolved into smoke at dawn, leaving only a faint scent of myrrh. The queen declared 7 days of mourning. The priests called it purification. But the fires she had tended refused to go out. Even after the palace guards doused them, the embers rekindled by nightfall. The city glowed for weeks, as if holding its breath. I left soon after, carrying a small shard of clay from the palace hearth, etched with 2 lines, one northern, one southern. I still keep it wrapped in cloth. When I hold it near a flame, the script brightens faintly, breathing as if alive. That's how I know she endures, not as legend or saint, but as the quiet force that moves between worlds, teaching warmth to remember its origin. The covenant had traveled farther than we ever dreamed. From frost to fire, from survival to philosophy, from a mother's hands to a queen's. It was no longer ours to guard. It belonged to anyone who had ever chosen kindness over fear, anyone who had ever shared their last ember with another. The stranger who began it all had vanished centuries ago. But his gift, our gift, had become unstoppable. And somewhere, even now, it burns. It began, as endings often do, with silence. Not the gentle quiet of peace, but the heavy pause before something breaks. Saethem, once humming with song and trade, grew muted. The fires that had glowed in every courtyard flickered lower each night. The people felt it before they understood it, a subtle chill that gathered in the bones, a kind of fear disguised as weariness. They said the warmth was withdrawing its favor. I knew better. It wasn't leaving, it was being smothered. The priests had been waiting for their moment. They moved through the city like smoke, whispering of divine wrath. The northern woman, they said, has trapped the sun in chains. She draws its breath into herself. That is why the days grow dull. They called her a thief of light, a desecrator of sacred fire. For months, they had tolerated her because the queen believed. But belief is fragile when confronted by hunger and fear. The drought gave them both. The rains stopped. The fountains that had once filled the streets with laughter turned to dust-lined basins. Crops withered under an indifferent sun. People began to look at their neighbors with suspicion, at their hearths with desperation. If warmth must be shared, they asked, Why do some fires still burn while ours die? The doctrine of unity became the language of blame. The council turned against the queen first. They accused her of weakness, of letting superstition rule policy. They said her fascination with the northern ways had angered the gods. Liana became the proof. Servant turned teacher, teacher turned queen. It was a story too easy to twist. The same mouths that once praised her now spat her name like poison. I was there the day they came for her. The air outside the palace shimmered with heat, but inside the corridors ran cold. The soldiers' torches burned pale, their light sickly. Liana met them in silence. She was wearing the same simple robes she had worn since the beginning, though her hair had grown silver at the edges, touched by ash. The priests read the charges: heresy, deception, corruption of divine order. Her response was a question. "Do you fear the fire?" she asked, "or that I showed you it belongs to everyone?" They took her to the Hall of Judgment, a space built to amplify echoes. Every word spoken there returned larger, distorted. I stood in the back, unseen among the scholars and servants. The high priest demanded confession. "You have taught that warmth is not the gift of the sun, but a spirit that dwells in all things. Do you deny it?" Liana looked around the hall, the marble columns, the crowd shifting like restless shadows. "I deny nothing," she said. "But I regret what I forgot to teach." The priest frowned. "And what is that?" "That every gift has its hunger." The silence that followed was unbearable. Some said the torches dimmed. Others swore the flames bent toward her, as if listening. Then she spoke her final words, so softly that the hall itself had to lean in to hear. "Fire does not ask who it warms." No verdict was announced. She simply vanished that night. Some claimed she escaped through tunnels beneath the palace. Others swore she dissolved into the smoke that rose from the city's 1,000 braziers. The queen, under pressure, declared her exiled. The priests called it divine judgment. The people called it justice. I called it loss. What followed was not punishment for her, it was punishment for all of us. The fires began to misbehave. Some refused to light. Others burned out of control, consuming entire houses in minutes. The balance she had maintained, the rhythm between breath and flame, collapsed. Saethem, city of eternal warmth, began to devour itself. The queen's health failed. She spent her last days wandering the empty halls, whispering Liana's name like a prayer no one dared repeat. When she died, the priests turned her funeral into spectacle. They built a pyre higher than the palace walls, claiming to return her spirit to the sun. But the fire refused to catch until a single old servant, one of Liana's pupils, stepped forward and exhaled softly over the wood. Then, and only then, the flame took. The priests called it miracle. I called it remembrance. In the years that followed, Saethem fractured. The cult of the servant queen spread underground, worshipping the idea of shared warmth. The temples outlawed open fires within the city, declaring them symbols of rebellion. People began to cook in secret, to whisper old breath patterns under blankets. Heat became contraband. Love, too, in a way, because both required trust, and trust had become dangerous. I fled north, carrying what I could. Mira's book of symbols, a shard of palace clay, and the memory of Liana's eyes as they reflected the flames of accusation. Along the journey, I stopped in villages where the cold had never truly ended. I told them fragments of the story, how the fire had once bound people together across deserts and snowfields. Some listened with tears, others with fear. A few lit small fires in her honor. None dared speak her name aloud. Back in Valmere, I found the covenant almost forgotten. The ashkeepers were fewer now, their rituals reduced to superstition. The old pit at the edge of the village had collapsed under moss. Yet when I unearthed its remains, I found one coal still faintly alive. I carried it home and set it in the hearth. It flared briefly, blue at its core, then steadied. For a moment, the entire room filled with the scent of resin and myrrh. I thought I heard a breath that was not my own. People say collapse is destruction. I have learned it is translation. What begins as faith becomes knowledge, then rule, then ruin, and finally myth. The warmth that once united us becomes story, a safer form of heat, one that burns only in memory. But even stories smolder, they wait for air. Liana's fall was not the end of the covenant. It was its release. Once the priests forbade her words, people carried them farther, whispering them in marketplaces and alleys, folding them into songs. Children learned them without knowing their origin. Heat is shared, breath is rhythm, power is balance. In time, the meaning would blur, the names fade, but the pulse would remain. Sometimes I think she knew this was how it had to be. That to survive, the fire needed to scatter. You can kill the hearth. You can't kill the instinct to gather around one. Now, when I stand by my own small fire and watch the embers tremble, I imagine her somewhere beyond the dunes or beneath the snow, tending another flame we'll never see. Perhaps she has become what she always was, a keeper of warmth, not its owner. Perhaps she is teaching others even now, in some forgotten corner of the world, that mercy is not measured by power but by proximity. Saethem's marble towers are dust. Valmere's huts are ghosts. Yet their ashes still hum with the same refrain. Fire does not ask who it warms. I used to think stories like ours ended when the pages burned out. That once names were forgotten, the fire died too. But history is more cunning than that. It buries itself where no one thinks to look, beneath glass towers, inside laboratory notebooks, between the lines of equations that pretend to explain everything. Even now, centuries later, I see echoes of Valmere and Saethem flickering in our modern world, disguised as progress. It started with an article buried deep in a science journal. Archaeologists in northern Egypt had uncovered fragments of a scroll, thin sheets of papyrus fused together by centuries of heat. The text, written in 2 languages, mentioned something called the breath of 2 worlds. One script was known, an ancient southern dialect linked to the empire of Saethem. The other, at first, seemed indecipherable. But when scholars compared its curves and symbols, they realized it resembled a northern trade script once used around the frozen valleys. Valmere's tongue, they said, long thought to have vanished. They translated only a few lines before the fragments disintegrated under air exposure. What remained was this: fire is the memory of kindness. Breath is the bridge between the living and the gone. Beneath it, faint as a whisper through ash, one name survived: Liana of Valmere. The discovery made headlines for a week, then vanished beneath more urgent news, politics, markets, storms. But it stayed with me. I printed the article and taped it above my desk, beside a photograph of the aurora taken from a research station in Greenland. 2 lights, north and south, forever chasing each other across time. Scientists argued over the find. Some called it coincidence, 2 civilizations inventing similar metaphors for heat. Others claimed cultural diffusion, a trade route lost to history. A few more imaginative voices suggested the fragments hinted at an exchange of knowledge, an ancient collaboration between cold and desert, between survival and abundance. None dared say the word faith. And yet, when I read those lines, I felt something stir that no data could explain. The phrasing was familiar, almost verbatim from the chants passed down by my grandmother. Heat is shared, breath is rhythm. Words that had survived in our family as lullabies, stripped of meaning but not of pulse. I realized then that I'd been living in the afterglow of the covenant all along, just without knowing its name. Maybe you have too. Every winter, cities around the world face power outages, and strangers invite each other in from the cold. Volunteers set up warming shelters. People share blankets with those sleeping in doorways. We call it compassion. The villagers of Valmere would have called it survival. When the pandemic came, and we learned to fear our own breath, we also learned its value. We measured distance, yes, but also proximity, how much warmth we could give without endangering each other. Even our machines learned the language of heat. Smart thermostats, thermal drones, cryogenic labs, all ways of bargaining with temperature, of mastering the very thing that once ruled our ancestors. But mastery was never the point. Balance was. And we are failing it again. Climate reports speak of rising warmth as catastrophe, but warmth itself is innocent. It's the imbalance that kills, the refusal to share its burden. Saethem burned from within because it mistook possession for reverence. We are repeating the lesson on a planetary scale. We hoard energy, trap heat beneath our own skies, and call it growth. The covenant we once lived by, give what you take, cool what you warm, lies forgotten beneath our algorithms. Sometimes I imagine Liana standing in one of our cities, watching the glow of neon signs reflected in rain. Would she recognize our towers as descendants of her palace, our electric grids as new ashkeepers? Or would she see only a civilization choking on its own flame? In a way, we are all ashkeepers now. Each of us holds a fragment of the old promise every time we charge a phone, cook a meal, or light a candle for someone gone. Energy moves through us, sun to wire, wire to hand, hand to heart. The covenant never ended, it just changed shape. We traded hearths for circuits, ash pits for batteries, myths for infrastructure. But the rule remains. Warmth shared is survival. Warmth hoarded is decay. Last year, I visited a museum in Cairo where they displayed what remained of the scroll. The papyrus was little more than shadow pressed between glass, but under special lighting, faint ink lines glowed blue, like embers under snow. I stood there for a long time, thinking of Mira's hut, of Liana's calm voice, of the stranger whose dust had turned night into dawn. The curator, noticing my silence, asked softly, "Do you see something familiar?" I smiled. "Yes," I said, "it's still warm." He laughed politely, not understanding. But I meant it. History still breathes. You can feel it if you listen the way Liana taught, slowly, through the heart. The hum is faint but steady, running through the wires in our walls, the engines in our streets, the veins beneath our skin. Sometimes, late at night, when the city outside my window sleeps and the radiator clicks like distant thunder, I imagine all the unseen fires burning across the world. Hospital generators, street lamps, a candle left in a window by someone waiting for another to come home. We think we've conquered darkness with technology, but perhaps we've only learned a more elaborate way to whisper the same prayer: stay warm. Come back soon. That's the real secret the archaeologists will never find written on clay or papyrus. The covenant was never about gods or chemistry. It was about empathy formalized into ritual, physics turned into compassion. We learned to share heat because we had to. We forgot to share it because we could. And so, I keep telling this story, not as history but as rehearsal. If warmth is memory, then remembering is an act of keeping alive. Each retelling adds air to the ember. Each listener becomes another keeper. Perhaps someday, when the lights fail and the wind returns to test our walls, someone will recall this. Not the names, not the kingdoms, but the rhythm. In through the nose, out through the heart. They will breathe together, and the fire will answer. Because it always does. And when it does, when that glow spreads once more across valleys and deserts, when strangers reach for one another without asking who deserves the heat, then maybe the old covenant will finally rest. Until then, I'll keep a single lamp burning beside my desk. Not for light but for company. The flame hums faintly, like a heartbeat remembering itself. And sometimes, just before dawn, I think I hear a whisper rising from it, familiar, patient, eternal. Fire does not ask who it warms. The night is quiet now. The last of the city's lights have surrendered to dawn, and the sky hangs between colors, not yet blue, not quite gray, like a breath held too long. I sit beside my small lamp, its flame wavering in the draft from the window, and I think of every fire that came before this one. From Mira's oven to the palace braziers of Saethem, to the neon hum of our restless century. The same impulse, reshaped by time, to make light when the dark arrives. The story feels finished, yet stories like this never truly end. They smolder, they wait, Each retelling feeds them a little more air, until someone else takes a spark and carries it forward. Perhaps that is what I've been doing all along, tending a fire whose warmth I did not earn, but was trusted to keep alive. When I was young, I thought history was a line, clean, deliberate, marching forward. Now I know it's a circle, glowing faintly at its edges, passing from one hand to the next. Every civilization builds its hearth, forgets its covenant, and then rediscovers it disguised as revelation. We call it progress. The fire just calls it repetition. Outside my window, the first sunbeam finds the glass of a neighboring building and splits itself into color. For an instant, the reflection paints my wall in gold and red, desert colors. Saethem's palette. The air warms by a fraction of a degree, and I imagine the queen standing barefoot on marble, breathing in through her nose, out through her heart. Somewhere beyond her, in another age, Mira lifts a glowing stone from her hearth and presses it to a child's chest. The past is closer than we think. Sometimes it's only a breath away. I close my notebook. The paper smells faintly of smoke, though there's no reason it should. Maybe that's just imagination or memory misbehaving. I've spent years tracing their story, but lately it feels as if the story has been tracing me. Each night I tell it, the flame in my lamp bends slightly toward my voice, like it's listening. I pretend not to notice. Some conversations don't need words. The archaeologists will keep searching for proof. They'll find fragments of clay, bits of glass, maybe even the bones of the palace itself. But the real evidence of the covenant isn't buried in sand or ash. It's in us, in the way we cup our hands around a match on a windy day, in how we draw close to one another when the air grows cold. We still perform the ritual, though we've forgotten its name. If you've been listening this far, perhaps you've felt it too. That quiet pull in the chest when the world darkens and someone, somewhere, lights a candle. Maybe you didn't know why it moved you. Now you do. You're an inheritor of warmth. A keeper, even if only for a moment. Before I end, let me confess something. I used to envy those ancient figures. The healer who could read the wind, the servant who became a queen. Their gestures seemed grand, their choices eternal. But as I've grown older, I see that grandeur was never the point. They didn't seek legend, they sought balance. Their greatness was domestic. The care of a child, the tending of a flame, the refusal to let despair go unchallenged. Legends only formed later, when people forgot that humility burns brighter than spectacle. That, perhaps, is the last truth the fire has to offer, humility. It reminds us that we are temporary. That every warmth we create is borrowed, every breath a brief partnership with the air. The fire doesn't belong to us. It simply allows us to share in its persistence. I rise and open the window. The morning air slips in, cool and clean. The flame shivers but holds. Somewhere in the distance, a siren wails, the modern hymn of our age, and fades into silence. I whisper the old words under my breath, in through the nose, out through the heart. The rhythm steadies me, just as it steadied them. If Mira could see this world of ours, cities wired with light, homes glowing long after midnight, would she call it triumph or warning? I think she'd smile that half-smile of hers and say, so long as someone tends it. If Liana were here, she'd ask harder questions. She'd want to know whether our fire still remembers mercy. Whether we've learned that warmth without compassion burns the hand that holds it. Maybe that's why I keep this little flame alive, as both comfort and reminder. To sit beside it is to feel the weight of time, but also its generosity. We were never meant to master fire, only to accompany it. And when it flickers low, our task is not to mourn but to breathe. I watch the flame until my eyes blur. The colors shift, orange to blue, blue to silver, silver to nothing. For a heartbeat, I think it's gone. Then, faintly, it steadies again, smaller but sure. I smile. That's how endurance works. Not in grand gestures but in persistence. A refusal to go out. Somewhere, far to the north, snow is falling over forgotten ruins. Somewhere to the south, desert winds carry dust across buried palaces. Somewhere in between, a mother holds her child close and hums an old tune without knowing why. The same tune, perhaps, that once rose from a valley of frost. The same lullaby that drifted through the halls of Saethem before the priest silenced it. The same breath that carried everything we've ever been. The sun is fully up now. The city resumes its rhythm, traffic, voices, the metallic heartbeat of industry. I should sleep, but I linger another moment, watching the lamp cast its soft circle on the desk. In that circle, there is history. There is faith. There is the memory of two women who refused to let the cold decide the limits of life. I lower the wick until the flame becomes a single, trembling point. For a second, it's small enough to believe I could carry it in my hand without pain. I whisper to it the only benediction that ever mattered. Fire does not ask who it warms. The light fades, leaving only the trace of warmth on my palm. Outside, the world inhales. Inside, I exhale. The story breathes.